My name is Douglas Campbell. I'm an associate professor of New Testament at Duke Divinity School, which is in Durham, North Carolina, which I enjoy because it's so nice and warm compared with where I taught before, which was London, and prior to that, the University of Otago in New Zealand, which is incredibly cold. I've just finished a book on all the basic introductory questions on Paul, which is called Framing Paul. And what happens is, in my humble opinion, many Pauline scholars kind of cheat a little bit when they make very basic decisions about how to frame up their story of Paul. And what happens is they all have to make judgments about which letters Paul wrote, what order he wrote them in, how many pieces they should be in, if they've been stuck together by an editor, whether they're authentic, this kind of stuff. And we all tend to make prejudicial assumptions right off the top and throw a whole bunch of letters out, say they're not by Paul, just because we don't like them. And we tend to chop letters up and control them that way. And I thought, well, we just have to go back and kind of clear all that bad argumentation away, clear the ground, and ask ourselves again what's going on. And I came to some surprising conclusions. I actually concluded that more of the letters were authentic than is commonly granted. So I ended up making a surprisingly strong case, I think, or taking a surprisingly strong stance on Ephesians and Colossians and 2 Thessalonians. I just think there are no good reasons initially for questioning their authenticity. I did have to go into a long searching struggle with 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus with an open mind, and I did conclude that they were probably written by somebody a bit later on. But I came to new conclusions about them as well. Often the debate is, well, are these faked or are they real? And that was not what was at stake. What was at stake was, I think, there was an attempt to rescue Paul's interpretation from people who were doing tremendous damage to the church. And a reading of Paul lay behind this kind of blatantly heretical and destructive approach. And it was really only a recovery of what he was saying in a kind of a safer, more moderate, more orthodox way that really saved him for the Bible. So it was a quite distinctive recovery effort. So this is kind of where I end up on this book. So it's called Framing Paul, and it will be out, I would think, in about a year. It'll be hopefully out for SBL in San Diego. The Deliverance of God is possibly a little too long. I admit that now. And what I'm trying to do there is articulate and scrutinize a particular reading of Paul that's generally known as the Lutheran reading of Paul. But the first thing I wanted to say was, this is really not very fair to Lutherans. I mean, there are a lot of Lutherans out there that don't read Paul this way, they don't read the gospel this way. Luther himself did not read Paul this way, but the Lutheran reading of Paul is like a construct within the academy, gets tacked on to Luther, and I fear that it's become quite destructive. It sort of encases Paul in a moralizing posture, and it frames him up with this slightly superior posture towards outsiders and towards Jews, which then stops us from being able to hear what he's really trying to tell us most of the time, which is very engaged and incarnational and sensitive and benevolent, a kind of a humble, kind, gentle gospel is what's generally coming through from Paul. But this Lutheran reading of Paul gets in the way. So the book is scrutinizing the texts that underpin that reading and suggesting that this is not the best way to read them. It's actually the commitment by previous interpreters to this reading, to this construct, that has overridden subtle little signals in the text and slightly distorted them. And when we step back and go, well, hang on a minute, I'm bringing kind of concerns to these texts, certain constructions, certain perhaps moralizing slightly moralizing constructions. When I step back and get in touch with that, and expose that, those constructs are doing the work, and not the texts themselves. So I peel that away, and then I say, well, actually we can read these in a very different way, and the result is this kinder, gentler Paul. Well, the apocalyptic reading is really simple, and it's basically signaling that if you want to understand Paul, you start that whole story with Jesus Christ. And you start it with him actively revealing himself to you through the Spirit. So you start the story with God. You don't go to find God. God comes to find you. And this is kind of what happened to Paul. And it's really what happens to all of us. This is what happened to me. So the signal is that truth claims have to be grounded in God and not in our own processes of discovery or self-discovery. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing back there on the Lutheran reading, which actually starts the story somewhere else. It starts the story with the person searching for meaning, or searching for freedom from judgment, or searching the cosmos for God, deciding that God is revealed there, coming to a whole bunch of conclusions, and then getting the gospel, by which point all the key truth claims have been made. And Jesus is then controlled by these. The Christ of that construct is not the Christ who is the Lord of truth and time and space and people and Judaism. So that's the signal I'm sending with the apocalyptic thing. The rhetorical move is the main move that I make on the main text that I would argue is doing the damage. The damage is done by particular reading of Romans 1:18 through 3:20, so Romans 1-3. And this is usually read as a kind of a philosophical demonstration of the truth of God, just as I was talking about it before. It's a truth that you kind of work out for yourself by reading the cosmos, studying it, sensing what God is like. And then it's a truth that Jews are meant to sense in a similar sort of way. And what I'm arguing is that's actually a misreading of the text. I don't think Paul is laying out his gospel at that point. I think Paul is engaging with the gospel of an opponent. So he's got somebody at Rome that he's dealing with in very much the same way that he's dealing with somebody in Galatia and in Philippi. I mean, the reason why he writes part of Philippians and most of Galatians is also, I would suggest, the reason why he writes Romans. It's not rocket science. He writes these letters to deal with a problem person. And so the best way to read the problem text, Romans 1-3, is rhetorically, as an argument that's actually folding back on itself. If I had my life again, I might call it a Socratic and apocalyptic rereading of Paul. And that might be a little bit more accurate, a little bit more helpful. But the argument is Socratic, so it takes someone else's position and then exposes the contradictions and the tensions in that position. Hey, if you start off talking like this is where you end up, and you end up over here, and you don't really want to go there, do you? And then the Roman Christians are sitting there going, if a guy walks through the door that talks like that, we know exactly why we shouldn't listen to him. So that's the rhetorical dimension. Well, we're all speaking from somewhere. We are. And we need to be upfront about that. And yeah, really, as I said before, if you're a Christian, I think the place that you are speaking from is a place ultimately of revelation. The church is built on its conviction that God has come to us in Christ. That's what we've always agreed on. That's what all the creeds say we have to agree on, and they're right. I mean, this is where we know what God is like. We know what God is like because God has come to us and become one of us, and that's the heart of the Christian message. So that's where I stand. That's where I am. But that has tremendous implications for what we do with salvation and for how we understand the Scriptures and what we think the church is about. And in the light of that stance, which is really just good old-fashioned orthodoxy, I can see a problem in this alternative account of Paul. One of the problems I have with this version of the gospel that I'm really criticizing and undermining is it doesn't seem to realize that by approaching Paul in the way that it does, what we call forward or prospectively, it builds from a particular account of the problem and then builds its Christian solution on top of that. So all the hard work, all the heavy lifting, all the key truth claims take place when you're setting up the problem. And the problem primarily revolves around Jews and Judaism. So what you have to say about Jews is A, this is what you're like, even when they disagree with you. And B, you're deeply morally and rationally defective if you don't convert to Christianity and leave most of your Judaism behind. So the definition of the rightness of the Christian gospel is premised upon the wrongness and the stupidity of Judaism. Now, you just do not want to go there anymore, and I don't think for a moment that Paul went there. This is a reading that comes straight out of the teaching of contempt, as it's known in the history of the church. This is the sad, the dark side of the church that we need to be scrutinizing. And if we just assume for a moment that Paul wasn't actually doing this, new possibilities open up for us. But this is where we go when we read Romans 1-3 and Romans 1-4 forward, when we construct Paul, first of all, in accordance with this Lutheran construction. And we just need to call time on this. It's got to go. It's not the only problem involved with this reading, because it's pretty horrible about non-Christians who are not Jews. It moralizes at them. The first thing it says to the non-Christian is, you know what you have to understand about God, the God of Jesus Christ, he doesn't really like you. You're in deep trouble. And that's his fundamental posture unless you do something about it. Now that is not what I think the heart of the gospel is for Paul. Paul thinks that God cares about you even when you are an ungodly and sinful person. While you were ungodly, while you were still hostile, Christ died for you because he loved you. That's God's fundamental posture towards you. So if you get hold of that, if you think that's what Paul's really all about, you have to put pressure on this other way of reading him in these other texts. And that's what I've been trying to do. Now, I don't know how clearly that message gets through. I think I overcomplicated it a bit. Having said that, you can't please everybody. You've got to get in amongst the text. You've got to do very detailed work. It's very difficult to shift people's readings. We read these ancient texts in a way that we've been taught to read them. There are a myriad interpretive decisions in place, and learning to read them in a new way is incredibly painful, difficult work. Now, I don't know any other way of doing that other than walking you through these texts bit by bit, step by step. It takes time.
Well, I'm wondering, as are probably many, what then becomes of justification by faith? Because you roundly criticize justification theory, as you call it. Right. And,
I wish I hadn't called it that now. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to let you explore that.
Yeah. I'm not actually down on justification necessarily, because justification means 100 different things, and a lot of them are really good. It's so important to Western Christianity as a notion and a concept that a lot of theological work has been attached to it and done in relation to it. I have absolutely no problem with that. What I'm worried about is a particular construal of justification that's very hard-edged, quite conditional, and premised really on a retributive understanding of God. I think that's problematic. So we could call it a contractual understanding of the gospel, or a conditional understanding of justification. What I would suggest is going on is when Paul uses this verb dikaio, which we translate with justify, when he's really spelling out what he thinks is going on, a text like Romans 6 is going to give you the best lead on that. So he uses the verb in 6:7. And it's actually not translated very comfortably by justify there. You have to translate it delivered or set free. Because what he's talking about is when you get baptized into Christ, you get immersed into his death, you get executed, and then you get resurrected into new life. And then he uses this verb. And so what he's talking about is somehow being kind of set free from a prison, a constraint, a slavery, delivered from that, released from that. And you say, well, how did you get released? Well, you got released through Christ. So the faith bit for Paul is never just about you. It is about you. You're important. But it's also about Christ himself. And so he likes to talk about, I think, the faithfulness of Christ is the one who breaks us out of this prison. He's the one that kind of breaks open this slavery. And his fidelity is a reference mediated by a scriptural text, Habakkuk 2:4, to his suffering and his crucifixion, his death, and his burial, resurrection, and ascension. So it's a little subtle hint that the Bible is predicting that Jesus is going to set us free, bring us to life. And then your faith is a sign. It's evidence that Christ is at work in you, that you're part of this process, that you've been set free. As you evidence trust in God, belief in God, fidelity to God, loyalty to God, long-suffering even. Slightly more unpopular virtue, that last one, but we maybe need to recapture it. As you evidence these things, this is the fruit of the Spirit in your life, and it's evidence that you're part of this process. So justification by faith, for me, is a story not of appropriation, it's a story of assurance. It's a story that speaks comfort to Christians who are under threat from often other Christians who are telling them they're not doing the things they need to do. If someone comes to you with a conditional mentality and says, well, you might think you're a Christian, but you're not really. You need to do a whole bunch of stuff that you're not doing or you're not saved. This can put you in a very, very threatened, insecure place. How do you respond to that? You respond with justification by faith. And you say, hey, do you believe that Jesus is Lord? Yes, I do. Do you believe that God raised him from the dead? Well, yes, I do. Do you confess that with your mouth? Do you believe it in your heart? Yes, I do. Chill out. You're okay. You're saved. Now, stop worrying about yourself and start worrying about other people. That's kind of where it goes. I mean, I try this on my classes regularly. I'm shocked at how insecure they are about their faith, which is, if you're insecure about your faith, you're worrying about yourself, you're getting all introverted, maybe even narcissistic, you're not worrying about the people that God's putting next to you that you're meant to be reaching out to and helping. So I say to them, are you sure that you're saved? Is everybody happy about the fact they're, saved? Put your hand up if you think you're saved. Kind of like 60% of the class will put up a timid hand. Well, I say, look, this is a seminary, this is terrible. You need to know, if you're here and you think Jesus is Lord and God raised him from the dead, you're fine. Okay? You're good. You've made it. Now, stop worrying about all that. Stop being insecure and start opening your eyes and seeing the people that God wants you to love. Right? It's not rocket science.
I want to know, what are some surprising interpretations you came to? Some things that your reading brought out that you didn't expect. Well,
the big one that people struggle with is the suggestion that Romans 1-3 is Socratic, that it's an argument that states a position and then shows how it collapses internally. It works pretty well because it solves a bunch of problems in the text that we couldn't solve before. We didn't know what to do with people who are righteous pagans seem to get saved. They're running around from time to time. Nobody knew what to do with them. Well, they work perfectly as Socratic reduction to absurdity. If you're saying this, then you end up with all these righteous pagans saved by works, and you're a missionary preaching the Jewish law. That's kind of stupid, isn't it? Duh. And then the reason why that's in tension with the later move in the argument where God really shuts down on all of humanity and says you're all sinful, seems to contradict these righteous pagans. Well, that now makes sense, because he is shutting down on the whole argument. He's saying, well, the other problem with you is you don't really know how sinful people are. They can't do this stuff that you're telling them to do. They can't look at the cosmos and work stuff out. They can't respond to God. They're too sinful. They need help. They need to be rescued. So that whole kind of approach to Romans 1-3, I think, is new to a lot of people. I was taught that the faithfulness of Christ was a strong reading in graduate school, and I guess I've only really strengthened in my belief in that. I didn't really connect strongly with the possibility that Habakkuk 2:4, the righteous one through faith will live, which Paul quotes in Romans 1:17b. I hadn't really connected with the possibility that that was about Jesus, and I think now I'm much more confident about that. The righteous one, I think, is Christ, who will live, in a sense, be resurrected after its fidelity. I wasn't aware at how well the treatment of Abraham would fit with what I was, in Romans 4, would fit with what I was suggesting. There are a lot of problems in that text for Lutherans. There's the longest treatment of faith in Paul. There's one of the longest treatments of anybody, apart from Jesus, at the back end of that chapter, from verse 16 through to verse 22, when it's talking about Abraham, and he's not wavering. He didn't have a moment of doubt, not a flicker of doubt, even though God has come up and said, I know you're almost 100, Sarah's pretty old as well, but you're going to have a kid, everything's going to be fine. Not a flicker of doubt, not a waver in unbelief. Exegetes skirt around that text like it's radioactive for very good reasons from their own point of view, which is, if that's what we have to do to be saved, we're all completely doomed, right? If that's the nature of saving faith, we've had it. But once you're starting to read faith with one eye on the Christian, one eye on Jesus himself, all of a sudden, oh yeah, that starts to make sense. Yeah, there's a Christological lens that's at work here that's making sense of this. Paul's reading this use of Genesis 15:6. He's thinking about the story of Jesus all the time. So that was probably something that was a little bit surprising to me, but I felt was surprising in a good way. And works of law, I ended up arguing, and this is very important, wasn't really an account of Judaism. It's part of a kind of moralizing Jewish Christians' gospel. That's the problem. The circumcision, the works, the stuff you have to do. This is what I call a Jesus and approach. Yeah, you believe in Jesus. Even the demons do and shudder. Do that. But if you're a guy, you got to get circumcised. All of you got to start obeying the Jewish law. So it's kind of a legalistic Christian that's doing the damage there. And the beauty of this is, when Paul pushes back on this hard and says, that's not really even a gospel at all. It's not worthy of the name of gospel, because you've short-circuited the role of Christ. When Paul pushes back on this moralizer, the way I read these texts, it's no longer about Jews. We no longer are dealing with a constituency way the heck out there. We don't know any Jews. We just know they're bad. It's now asking us to look at ourselves as Christians and say, am I one of these moralizing, conditional kind of leaders who is laying heavy burdens on other Christians and not raising a finger to help? Am I one of those? Or am I really in touch with Paul's gospel of grace? These texts turn into texts that should elicit confession and repentance. And when you look around the church today, do we need to be hearing the message, the gospel is not about moralizing? Hell yes. Yeah. So maybe that was a surprise too, where I ended up with that stuff. It's a bit of a moralizer in my youth. Probably still am.
Well, so who do you envision reading this book? It's a big book.
It is a big book. Yeah. You'd be surprised who is reading it. There are Bible translators. I had an email exchange last week with a guy who works in food system distributions for Cisco or something. He's reading it. Now, does admit that he doesn't probably understand all of it, but he's chugging through it with his son. So it's out there, and a lot of people that I would not have anticipated reading it are doing that. So I really hope that continues. I hope Bible translators keep reading it, because they seem to find it interesting. I hope academics read it, don't just buy it, stick it on the shelf. I hope they maybe teach a course on Justification on Paul. Maybe they could teach a course on the post-New Perspective reading of Paul, which is what it really is. I think that would be a pretty interesting walk. Use it as a supplement to courses on Romans and Galatians in particular. Read the exegetical things at the back. Use it in hermeneutics courses perhaps, because what I'm suggesting is a methodology for giving an account of how our presuppositions are shaping our reading of the text. What's tended to happen in the past is some scholars have gone, well, you know, it's all about your presuppositions. Therefore, the text is just completely unstable. And people who respect the text a little bit more, Bible scholars, people who care about the Bible as scripture, they've backed off from that, understandably, and said, well, it's not just about you and your presuppositions. I'm getting told something here. But they've tended to back right off the role of presuppositions because they don't know how to process those. So the situation's quite polarized. And I think what I've actually managed to do in the book, people don't notice this, is I've actually developed an architecture of certain presuppositions and showed how they lead to certain detailed decisions in the text and where the text can speak against that, push back on it. So I've traced through the connections quite specifically in detail, which hasn't really been done before. And this is why the book's so long. It's because tracing that architecture of interpretation through takes a lot of time. But it's really a new way of giving an account of how we read. And I'm not against presuppositions. We all have to have them. I mean, I'm really promoting the thought of the philosopher Michael Pauline. Pauline gives an account of presuppositions and how you can't think, you can't do anything. You don't get anywhere without presuppositions. So you've got to have them in play. But just how you have them in play constructively is the key. So the book is trying to, in a preliminary way, try to deal with some of this.